All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. I think we're about, if it hasn't switched yet, it's about to switch to 7. But hang on, there's someone else who needs inside.
Oh, I had a driver.
So obviously we're talking about the book of Daniel. I was curious, I don't see a whole lot of additional people, but I was just curious, again, no requirement, but did anybody happen to read Daniel beforehand? Okay, I knew Mike was telling me he did. And I was like, oh, that might have been a good idea to suggest. But no pressure again if you didn't. I was just curious because I will be interested to hear your thoughts as we kind of like talk about this tonight. But first, can we talk a little about some of the key features? Just a little review again of what does biblical apocalyptic literature look like? Just key things that we've talked about so far. Does anybody remember? Revelation. Okay, yep. It quite literally means revelation, right? And what do we believe? Jesus is the revelation, the truest, fullest revelation of God. Correct. So, excellent. Yeah. What else?
Destruction and restoration.
Destruction followed by restoration. Right. Yep. What else?
Lots of symbols.
Yeah. What kind of symbols?
You know.
I mean, I know, but do you know? That's the question, Davis.
That's a great question.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Numbers. Angels.
Okay, numbers.
Numbers and angels.
And angels. Yeah, and I would say also demons. Yeah. So, what else? What else?
Isn't it something to do with sort of a divine plan that has been predetermined?
Yeah, very deterministic. Like even the battles that we see between good and evil, like God is really the one in control, you know, and it's like often in a mysterious behind the scenes way, right? It's like regardless, there's not a whole lot of room for human action in it, like with the prophets, which seems kind of almost paradoxical, right? Very good. Yeah, no, very good.
Black and white, no gray.
Yeah, black and white, no gray. There is good and then there is evil. There is that which is God and that which is not. And God is not going to settle for anything less than what is fully God's. And it is going to be very hard on things that don't live up to those expectations. What are some of the things it's really critical of? Empire, especially power. You know, it sees a lot of the evil in the world as connected from this idea of power. You know, just how we organize our society, the way we relate to each other in positions of authority, how that leads to oppression pretty much all throughout history at different times, right? And it has that awareness, right? So we also know that it comes from context of oppression, especially with Jewish apocalyptic literature. It is rarely written at the height of Israel oppression. Very much an in, not in sight kind of oppression. Same for Christians. We'll talk more about it, but Revelation, we'll learn significant time of persecution amongst Christians. That's really a motivating factor for a lot of this, and the apocalyptic worldview seeks to try to explain that. And then, kind of as you were saying, everything ends in restoration. So this idea of new creation really is central. And also, like, what is creation, right? Understanding, like, what does it mean for creation to be, like, fully what it was meant to be? Hey. It is going to, again, have a very radical view of the new creation. It's something that is not seen before, right? There is no half measures towards new creation. And of course, the abstract symbols, spiritual warfare, very pessimistic determinist view. Well, that is all peaked with the book of Daniel. And if you're wondering about the image, yes, half of that is AI. And that is what you type in if you mention the craziest part. And Mike, can you tell us what probably that part refers to?
The horns.
The horns, right? The beast with the horns and
10 of them, then one of them.
Right. So if you take that description and plug it into AI, this is what it comes out with. And why do you think the lion is on the other side?
It's a symbol of power.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Strength, courage.
Think a little less symbolically. Like, what do you think of when you think of Daniel and lions?
Oh, it's the lion.
Daniel and the lion den, right? And that's what I've always found so interesting is, I think for most of us, especially those of us who grew up in the church and went going to Sunday school, when we talk about Daniel, it's not in this like scary apocalyptic, sense. We don't think about the end of the world often. We think about Daniel and the lion's den. We think about his friends. Who are his friends?
We think about
Exactly. Right? We think about the furnace, right? And that's really just one half of Daniel. All this crazy stuff is the second half. And so the kind of question is, how then does this apocalyptic view shape the whole? Because as we're going to see, like, Daniel as a whole is very apocalyptic and is very reliant on that apocalyptic worldview, even if the second half seems really unrelated to the first. So we're going to start with an activity, though, okay? And it's kind of hard to see. If you have a Bible, you might just want to look up the scriptures. But one of the big questions I kind of left hanging last time, but I wanted us to really focus on at the beginning of this, is what is the difference between prophecy and apocalypse, right? What makes Daniel unique from the other prophets? What makes him a separate from their genre? And I want us to get in groups of maybe like 3, at least one person have a Bible if you can, and look up these scriptures. And for about we'll do about 10 minutes to look at these and compare the two. All right, what differences do you notice? What's alike? What makes you think maybe this one might be more apocalyptic than the other, just on what you know so far, right? But especially look for the differences, right? The differences that are still based on the similarities, if that makes any sense. All right? So groups of 3 if possible, 2 at the least. So. Bless. Oh, wow. Making the pastor go get you a Bible. Remember, the best way to do it is to find the similarities first, because then that will also show the differences.
Well, don't be asking for the answers over there.
I'm just as curious as myself.
Is your smaller down the hall listening to the podcast right now?
Yes.
I walked past and I heard my own voice and I was like, oh my God.
And you're in here with,
Yep, under Greg Adams.
Okay.
It's less than.
So you got. Alright, so what are we doing first? We know this one.
What'd you teach?
Okay, yep, that's fine.
Go ahead.
Spirit of the
Yeah.
Lord shall rest on you. Spirit of wisdom and understanding,
Yeah.
spirit of counsel and might, spirit of
I would always try to take a swimming class while I was there, but the pool had asbestos in it.
was telling me, what's the covenant that the Lord will be in this person who judge righteously. In Daniel,
Briefly.
those particular verses,
Yeah, he's still there. He's still
No, she'll put his
there.
hand on the
really, the lamentation,
Open story.
you can do everything and know
Yeah,
everything,
regular
judge
laws.
everything, middle sinners, and,
No, I didn't know that. Just saw it in alumni.
punishing Israel and his children.
A couple months ago.
What do you see?
I must have missed that.
So I turned to the Lord in prayer and petition.
They say that you're gonna get your replacement.
Right. My eyes confessed, O Lord,
What is to come.
God, peace,
Peace.
truth, righteousness, is
Yeah.
Giving us
Turn away from your
advice,
cares.
Lord. And it's also for talents, which is very prophetic.
Lord,
It's very present.
And his
It's not very future looking, it's very present. He's talking to God, and
Yeah,
he's
I like the
saying, hey, we have justice. It's historic, it's looking back, and it's historic, and it's sort of an explanation of why Israel is being
Lord our God,
So we're supposed to tell the difference between.
we have not obeyed the Lord.
right.
And we deserve what we get.
Yeah.
He's giving us a prophecy of what is right with us. Hell, damnation, and take I think Isaiah is more prophetic and
Sounds familiar.
We're paying for it. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm screwed up the house.
all of that is.
It's giving not retribution. It's giving destruction. It's giving destruction. It's giving consequences.
Compare.
Yeah. Like verses and sworn judgments being poured out on us because we sinned. Disasters come on us.
Yeah, right. Well,
It's giving judgment.
I expect to see his right in the divine. So there's still,
Future tense.
it's written.
I noticed that.
And he has things. So I think that
Isaiah.
Evil snakes out of our
there's
mindset.
context that I know.
No, I guess hopeful might be the right word. Let's,
Us as snakes.
Put it in a context.
yeah.
After what I read, this is more intense. But also,
Yeah.
Even Nebuchadnezzar seemed impressed by
it
it.
always kind of circles back around. Like at the very end of this chapter, it says, "There shall be a highway from Judah for the remnant that is left."
He's seen the
Just leave
Lord
the
save
snake
his
alone
people.
here.
Nebuchadnezzar gone, and we're back into a Persian
Take
camp.
about one more minute.
So he's fallen out of favor. Right. Well, the second eye's out.
There's definitely no like, I mean, this is like future past tense, but there's no like pointing to that happens, except it's just sort of like pointing at ourselves for that. But Isaiah's really like, yeah,
basic having colors.
Yeah, yeah.
Something else.
So
There's
you
like,
would-
judges,
And there's some
I
sort
think
of
you're
extra
judges, and then you get the
point
divided
to,
kingdom.
whereas
And then, and that's right, and then Babylon, Babylon is.
Righteous judgment.
There will be something, you
One
gotta
is
go to
just
the
a
convention.
it's sort of like there's this chasm.
Yeah, those kind of turn to righteousness.
And Isaiah was like, maybe it's not as far as we think, like,
Intercede for
Right.
Yeah.
Like,
Isaiah says,
this is worse than we thought.
yeah, because we're progressing, right?
I know we said this.
We're gonna go, yeah, we're
However.
gonna go a little less over time.
I think
Things have
that's
changed.
no,
Yeah.
will take us as a
Second seed and exile.
And especially when you know, like this.
Separate the task of
All right, so what have people noticed? Yeah, they are different. They are different. Let's start with like some of the similarities. What are some of the similarities?
Powerful God.
Okay, yeah. Like God is still in control, you know, God is still the one to be relied on.
and forgiveness, asking for forgiveness.
Forgiveness, yeah. And especially for Israel, right? I mean, this is a very like Israel take, you know, like God's relationship with Israel.
The righteousness of God.
Yeah, righteousness of right. Yeah, that's actually really good. That's. Hold on to that. What else?
There's elements of like judgment and consequence in both.
In both, right? Right. How might those differ? Or do they? Do they differ in judgment and consequence?
But Daniel, in Daniel, it talks about this is what we've done, and we're gonna have consequences to it. And like in Isaiah, it's telling us what is to come. But you have to do what, you have to follow God and love God and follow His laws and stuff.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
are conditions placed on it.
Yeah, it almost makes me wonder, is like Daniel talking like as a result of Isaiah? If he's like, you know, if he's following up on what Isaiah's been saying. You
See
know?
what happened?
Like, there you go, see? Right?
Lead him right to the lion's den, definitely.
So I'm hearing like a lot more like probably pessimistic view in the apocalyptic. Probably.
The prophet is much more hopeful
Mhm.
and, you know, communicates hope, although in some of Isaiah,
Right.
he's like, hey man.
Yeah, well, especially if your hope is that, you know, humanity, we can do better. Like, we could do something different.
But see, Daniel's a dark time anyway.
Yeah, and we're actually going to be speaking a lot, because you're right. It was a dark time for them.
There's not any sunshine and roses.
Nope, nope. So here's a look basically at some of the basic things, at least for me, which are the difference between prophecy and apocalypse. And we've kind of touched on this. We saw, for me, the top one is there is a lot more focus on divine intervention, right? And so that really gets at the idea of like what apocalypse means literally, you know, revelation, this idea that God is breaking into history because only God can. And that's like what we believe about Jesus, you know, that God, or Jesus is God's self-revelation, you know, not something that we could attain and seek relationship with, but what that which had to break into human history in order to have a relationship with us. And you'll also see this in general in the prophets, a lot more big of a belief that reform is possible. You know, like part of their prophecies is to kind of spur the monarchy, you know, the leaders of Israel to do something different, right? They believe, in fact, we talk about how prophets were even a part of guilds, you know, that often in the court of the king. Look at Nathan and David, you know, and so there's this kind of mentality like, they're being really harsh, and like, yeah, they can start to sound almost apocalyptic if we're just looking at the similarities, but they're also still working within the system, right? Even when they're pushed out a little bit, they are still working with this kind of belief that the system can be fixed. And so with tied with that, there's this openness to the future, right? The future can be changed. The future can be done differently if we change our actions now. You know, God has not determined what's going to happen. God is, you know, walking with us as we're, you know, making this story unfold. But in the apocalypse, everything, it doesn't even matter what you do. You know, it doesn't matter how hard you try, even when it looks like that you are, you know, doing the right thing. It's really God's predetermined plan. You know, it's a little uncomfortable for us as Methodists, especially, right? You know, I mean, those you know, the big beef is Wesley, Calvin. You know, because what did the Calvinists believe? Election, predeterminism. You know, because it gets to this idea that like God, because God is sovereign and above all things, then God knows everything that will happen and kind of ordains everything that's going to happen. And Wesleyans have kind of resisted against that. We'll also start to see a different view of the Messiah and like this idea of a messianic figure. We see that emerge with prophets, but it's very much a monarchical Messiah. You know, it's very much a second David, right? It is a restoration of Israel's monarchy, which was like the golden days for Israel. That was what they sought to be before exile. Apocalypse is going to see a Messiah on a whole different scale. Not only is it going to look at, it's going to look at Israel's history in a much more cosmic view, right? An all-encompassing, like not just Israel subject to these things, but the whole world is subject to what is God's doing. And therefore the Messiah is going to be this very heavenly being, this cosmic figure, heavenly figure that is going to break into history and bring God's presence to Israel.
I'm sorry, can we pull on that string a little bit? Because isn't this fundamental to the difference between a Jewish or Hebrew concept of Messiah and a Christian acceptance of a Messiah?
So even the monarchical Messiah is nuanced in Christianity. Oh, is there someone here? Oh my goodness. Thank you.
I mean, isn't this why the Jews did not accept Christ as the Messiah?
Right.
Because he was not a monarchical figure, he was not a military figure, he was not a kingly figure, if you will.
Yeah, so and one thing, there's a lot of even nuance and diversity in that because there are, as we'll see, there were actually groups that thought the Messiah had already come.
Say
You know,
that
that a
again?
lot of
Say that again, what?
that there were actually groups that actually believed the Messiah had already come. And we'll talk more about why.
Okay.
Because that's actually a really good point, you know. But even in the variances of like what the Messiah looks like what the restoration of a monarchy even looks like, and again, having a much more probably human view, arguably. Like it is a God ordained person, you know, but it is still someone who is working within the context of the temple.
Got it.
Right, which itself is the bridge between God and humanity.
Okay.
Right, that changes whenever the temple is destroyed, and then that's kind of where you start seeing these different views of the Messiah. It's more cosmic, actually bridging to completely different realities into a new one. And then finally, again, there's this focus on mystery in Apocalypse. Right, it's focused on the things that we can't know, the things we can't say, the things we can't really understand. Right. Which itself is kind of, if you think about it, an acknowledgement of our own limits, right? I mean, how many of us would say that we can truly know everything? You know, how many of us can truly say that we know all of how the universe works? I mean, even when you look at how the universe works, I mean, there's some pretty weird things that happen, right? We know reality works in ways that just don't make sense to our experience. So Apocalypse is probably going to acknowledge that a lot more. And that really ties with a lot of the determinism even, because in its essence, that determinism is more focused on the fact that God, is so beyond. If God is the source of all things, then even our language of God is going to be limited. Talking about like what is the future and like God's role in relationship with that.
Like God is God, I mean.
Right, exactly. All right. So, some background on the book of Daniel. One, it's the latest composition in the Hebrew Bible. All right, so it really is like when the Jewish scribes and communities were putting together the canon, their canon. This was kind of the last to make the cut. This was towards like the very end. Like they still recognize it as canon as compared to like something like the Maccabees, which is apocryphal, or like the Book of Enoch. This has much more weight than those. However, it is very much at the end of that. It's also the only example in the Hebrew Bible, again, because those others were extra biblical. It's the only example of an apocalypse in the Old Testament. As we'll see, that New Testament can be viewed as a whole as really apocalyptic. But in terms of what our Jewish brothers and sisters would recognize as an apocalyptic genre, Daniel is really the only example there. And as we kind of talked a little bit about, it's divided into two parts. And this starts with Daniel's chapters 1 through 6, which, are the traditional story of Daniel in the lion's den and the furnace. And then it just has that hard cut, into the second section, to Daniel having this vision, right? Which ends up being the focus of so many prophecies and conspiracy theories and things that really it just was not at all. And that's, next thing, it's important to know that it was interestingly written in both Aramaic and Hebrew. Now, does anybody know or remember what Aramaic is? Can anyone tell me what Aramaic is?
Jesus language.
Okay, yeah. Does anyone know, no, you're right, absolutely. Does anyone know, kind of its origin? I'm sorry?
I mean, isn't it from, the from the Nazareth region, and wasn't it just a unique language to that part?
I don't think so. So it was definitely a lot larger scale, but it was very much in Judea, possibly emphasized more in Galilee. There might be something I'd have to look into that more, but basically what it was, its origin came as a combination of Greek and Hebrew. All right. So we talked about what was the big earth-changing event that really changed Judaism, in how it practiced and understood itself. That really redrew the whole map of the world. Yeah, what? I think you're right. Yeah.
Was it Greeks?
The Greeks, led by who? Alexander the Great, right? So that was a huge event because it introduced Hellenism. And Aramaic is a result of that Hellenistic influence on Hebrew. And so that really, shows us exactly when it was probably written, right? That helps us date it a lot easier. But what's interesting is how it's combined with Hebrew. So it really is reflective of older memory too. But again, what it points to is the fact that Daniel has gone through several stages of editing in reality. We talked about how really all of Torah, all of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, went through multiple stages of editing based on what is needed and what God was speaking to the community at the time. Just in the same way, David is done like that. It is largely not a historical, but that doesn't mean that the experiences of God in it and how God has been revealed to Israel are not true. So that's the important thing I want to remember, is that just because some of these things may be symbolic in Daniel, may be not actually historical, that doesn't mean that the experiences and witness that are speaking there were not historically real, And big point of Apocalypse, as we'll see with the images and poetic imagery, is it captures truths that can't really be articulated unless you've gone through something as traumatic as the people of Israel had gone through. for generations. And then really emerges from this context of Hellenistic absolutism, right? So not only was Hellenism everywhere, but the Greeks were really, really antagonistic with it. I mean, Alexander the Great wanted to assimilate everyone into this Hellenistic culture, creating this huge, like, global empire where everyone has a shared culture, has a shared language, has no cultural distinction, specifically is adopting the ideals, the more civilized ideals, the more progressive ideals of the Greeks and what they saw.
Now, the city-states developed independently of each other because it was so hilly.
Mm-hmm. Right.
They spoke the same language, but
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they developed differently.
And even whenever it was such a strong influence, it's like even when you had the city-states, obviously Alexander the Great died, and his empire split up. Even when they were split up, you had this huge influence that continued to grow and shape, and really want the cultures within it to assimilate to it, the more powerful culture. So that's the context that Daniel really comes out from. So who is Daniel, right? What's the historical Daniel look like? Well, I'm going to be honest again. There probably was not a historical Daniel. All right. Now,
Wait. You don't think there was a human being who served in the court of Nebuchadnezzar?
unfortunately not.
Okay.
And
all right.
what's-
So this is a story.
it is a story, yeah.
All right.
Again, shaped by real experiences, and meant to speak to real situations. But what's interesting, we'll talk about this a little more, is most of the people reading this at the time kind of would expect this. There actually probably was not that big of an assumption that Daniel was this huge presence in Jewish life that everyone just knew, and that everyone all knew this story, and then eventually someone just like wrote it down.
Well, Wiersbe said he was 16 when he was captured.
Right, and so
He was young.
Yeah, and again he's like, I think what we'll see is he's mostly mythical, but he is like reflecting real things at the time, right? He is really kind of shown as a model Jew for diaspora.
Yeah, okay, I got you.
He's really, and again, it's after Nebuchadnezzar. If we're thinking of this in the time of Alexander the Great, this is a bit after Nebuchadnezzar. So there's one we would think probably they're reflecting on that, And what is the model person in that time? Who was the person? Who were the people that were modeling what you were supposed to be in exile as a Jew? This is that person, Daniel. And there may have been some like legendary myths from outside cultures. There's some talk about Canaanite influences and things like that. But really, the important thing is how Daniel is being portrayed as a model for Israel. And he's also shown as a dream interpreter, right? He is shown. Who are some other dream interpreters in the Old Testament? Joseph, right. So again, tying this idea to older traditions, of like dreams and these stories in Israel's history, and kind of reintroducing them to this character to help emphasize these things. And the other big thing is that Daniel really models in a way to be accommodating, in the sense that he was working for the king. He was, living in a sense peacefully with the king. Yet he was not forsaking his faith. And in a sense, God, one could argue, that God's deliverance was working through his willingness to accommodate through his faithfulness. Now, of course, that results in conflict with Daniel, but it had nothing to do with him not being faithful, right? So there is a little bit of a more accommodationist view at this point, especially in the memory of Israel at that point. But that's not to say that it stays there, all right? And that there's not a healthy skepticism of power, because, again, power often doesn't want you to be faithful, and being faithful oftentimes crosses with power. So here's the structure of Daniel. Again, it's part 1, part 2. We got part 1, which are the court tales. And the reason I say that is because if we look in the Hebrew Bible, there are actually other court tales. Does anyone know of what other potential court tales?
Esther?
Esther is the exact one I was thinking of. And in fact, if you look in Judaism, even though we consider as Christians Daniel to be in the prophetic works, Judaism sees them as part of the writings, which would include Esther, right? So, there's this again, Esther being tied, existing in this kind of Hellenistic period, same kind of context. How do you exist, in a dominant culture as a faithful Hebrew? And that is what the first half is really trying to argue on behalf of Daniel, the example that Daniel is kind of presenting. And we see, again, I kind of added some, feel free to take photos of that or whatever, but I try to give an idea of kind of the different parts, where scholars kind of think they emerge from. Again, we have early memories of Babylonian exile, and again, this was probably in multiple forms during different times. The earliest form probably being like right after exile, right when they were allowed back into Israel by the Persians. But it goes as far, probably even to the Maccabees, which, do we remember talking about the origin of Hanukkah? Right. And that becomes a very important thing, that context of the Maccabees. And in fact, the second half is probably the later part. And so we see, even within this first half, a separate memory from what Daniel is in its fullest form, right? So part 2 is in addition for the most part, and we generally believe that based on its style and just, there's a reason it seems so abrupt, right? That's actually a good eye if you see that it's very abrupt, because that probably shows that they added it. And what's so good about, I actually heard on a podcast, what's so good about if you look at the Jewish tradition of editing is they're really good about just adding things and not deleting anything else to the point where it just seems kind of like, what? They don't really do a whole lot of work to go and fix the continuity errors and stuff. But that's what, if you even see how it jumps to different kings at different times, that should tell us in itself that it's not purely historical, and therefore not the point, because people, again, would not recognize it as such. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. And again, this was from our first session, just to show you where it is kind of happening in the timeline. We've had the Second Temple creation. Probably from here is where some forms of it may have started. But it goes probably all the way to here. So that whole period of time is kind of the period that Daniel is being written in. And that is a very, let's say, very filled with a lot of action. Lots of changes in leadership and who's running what, and a lot of histories being written by the powerful, and it seeming like the same story over and over. They saw a lot of repetition, let's say, in that period of time. And meanwhile, they were also the ones suffering, right? And it's also a long time that they're seeing that the prophets, the calls for deliverance, the expectation of messianic deliverance, not happening yet. There starts to become a realization that maybe this is going to be a lot longer than we thought. And so how do we deal with that? And there's one especially important figure that is kind of the base of Daniel, and that Daniel's form as we know it now. There's this guy named Antiochus IV. All right, and this is really the villain of Hanukkah. If you ever want to ask your Jewish friends what they think of Antiochus IV, there's probably literally no greater villain other than maybe the devil, and I don't know, Caesar maybe, but definitely in that same vein, and definitely has a lot of the most historical critiques by the Jewish rabbis and scribes, because he was a huge source of Hellenistic persecution by them after Alexander the Great's empire, after his general, the Ptolemies, fell. the Seleucids came, and he was in the line of their rulers. And he was known as being kind of a madman. He was one of those that kind of had that Nero kind of personality, which, you know, we've all seen the tyrannical dictators throughout history, right? And how those repeat, maybe even more in current times. You won't get, you know, make your own connections. But just in the same vein, we see how repetitive it is. And this guy's in that same vein, right? So we have this context of just, you know, low-key, not well leader who's very narcissistic, very much enjoys hurting and oppressing people. And he particularly persecuted the Jewish people by desecrating their temple, building a temple to Dionysus, forbidding them from worshiping Yahweh, and basically, just laid down the law. And for it was trying to expedite this sense of assimilation, because for him, due to some conflicts, which, you know, were also a little bit self-inflicted, I won't get into that though, some conflicts that made him feel like, you know what, we just need to take away this Jewish thing. We need to take away this Judaism, and he was just one of those that saw himself as a god and could do that. You know? And so he becomes a big source of Daniel and a lot about what was on people's minds at that time and that sort of critique of Antiochus. But what's interesting is he seems to go a little differently than what maybe a lot of people at the time would have. And that's because everyone loved this guy, right? So have you heard of the Apocrypha? So two of the books are 1st and 2nd Maccabees, okay? And Maccabees emerges from these people, from this family. These were the Maccabees, and they are ultimately the ones who overthrew Antiochus IV and brought in what's called the Hasmonean dynasty, which up until the Romans was what was ruling Israel at the time. And he was an almost messianic figure, right? He and the Maccabees were looked at, he was a priest, and a lot of people saw him as like the prophetic answer to prayers. This was the restoration of the David monarchy. This was the messianic figure that we've been looking for.
This is the king and the warrior that.
He was a warrior king.
Right. He was the one who relieved them of Antiochus, right?
Exactly. Restoring purity to the temple, you know. He was the one who would allow Israel to be a nation again. And
that's why they didn't accept Christ, because he didn't come like him.
In fact, if you look at that name Judas, it becomes one of the most common names at that time. Why? Because he was so revered, especially in the context of Rome's oppression, as like this figure that would finally save them, just like the Maccabees did.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but so why isn't there more textual work on this Maccabean Messiah? I mean, so if this was the model for the messianic expectation, and Daniel was, you know, being written as a historical novel, if you will, why wasn't there a book written about him as a human Messiah that the Jews were expecting?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, Daniel itself is kind of speaking to what was probably circulating time. Another thing too is like there is a large oral tradition, you know, so there's probably a lot of like oral things happening, and even what we have, there may be whole works that we don't even have access to. Like pretty much the only reason we have Daniel is just because it's preserved in Torah and then preserved in, you know, Christian canon. So there may have been other things circulating on paper.
Right, sorry.
But no, that's a good point, because we also do see a lot of the allusions in like Book of Enoch and stuff, and we see in a lot of the extra biblical works. If you really look at that, even Maccabees kind of paints him as a messianic fulfillment.
Thank you. Sorry.
So there are hints of it, but you're right. It's not quite as like written out as you would hope or want.
A hero like this, you would have thought to be more published.
Right. Because again, even that was still, there were still enough people that would have found that contentious. and a little bit in the apocalyptic realm. Now, I do want us to talk about, we're getting close to end. We've 15 minutes, but I do want us to talk about like the four beasts, because I'm sure that's what everyone's, probably came here for, honestly, is what do I tell my friend at work about the beast when he keeps talking about the book that he read, and like, what's the deal with that? Well, believe it or not, like most of the things in Daniel, it is symbolizing something current at the time. We see with the lion with the eagle's wings, which, again, even some of these are said in Scripture, in the text itself. It's identified with the Babylonian Empire. And so we see this first empire emerge. Then we see the bear, which is often thought of as the Medo-Persian Empire, right? And the Persians, who were they? They're the ones who let Israel back into Israel. Those are just some of the things that we see, why scholars kind of identify it with that. We see royalty, dominance. Someone's mentioned like power with a lion or something like that. I mean, that is what kind of they're getting with, and why the connection with Babylonia is there, and why scholars think it's that, and tradition.
It's like they devour each other. It's like the bear takes the lion, and then the leper comes in, and then the other one.
So if they're like thinking of those as kingdoms, right? Seems like a lot of infighting, like animals fighting, right? Starts to paint a different picture. Like when you think of these kingdoms, it's like animals fighting. Even something like Persia, which again you would think would have a positive view of. I mean, they let you back in your homeland. Even them. Then we see four-headed leopard with four wings. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian Empire.
The lepers are sneaky.
And they're fast, which is kind of what Alexander's military conquests were known as. Speed, swift, like they hit you before you even know it. And that's how he was able to expand so quickly. So
they're good at hiding, and then if they ambush.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and that's the kind of thing they're trying to like paint Macedonia as, which people would have associated at the time. They would see, oh yeah, that does sound like the Greeks. That does sound like, oh yeah, that's a great way of capturing that. That's a good, yeah. A lot of people would be seeing that in the same way. And then finally, this is why we think it's at the Maccabees' time. That fourth beast is most likely Antiochus the fourth, in reference to him, because that was the emerging beast at the time. Right? That was the empire that was now emerging. This was now the new danger, and it was just this repeating of the same old. Right? So there's this awareness, again, if we're looking at it in this way, there's this awareness that empire seems to be having a difference, regardless of who's in charge. Empire seems to be repeating itself. And there doesn't seem to be any like truly noble or, holy form of authority. Like we just keep getting thrown under the rug under all these people in reality. Sure, they let us worship, but they're also like animals fighting each other. And so there's really this kind of like zooming out kind of mentality that's happening. It's like, wait a second, we're seeing something here. And Daniel is really making that point with what's happening in his time. And what that does, that's interesting, is it acknowledges the particularity of what's happening. But it also reminds you, don't think that this can't happen again. A generation from now can have a whole nother one. Look, in fact, he might have actually been predicting Antiochus to be turning before he even turned.
Well, it's all throughout history. It keeps going and going and repeating and repeating.
And so it doesn't want you to think that, oh, these people are going to be in charge now. Everything's going to be great. Nope. They're in the same thing that other group was in. And we'll see that. Well, we don't really have time, I'm sorry. We're going to go from the...
There's Julius Caesar or Augustus. Which one?
So, the main takeaways that we're going to take away from Daniel, knowing the context, the historical context of it, and the way it's written and what it's trying to get at, is one, Daniel's going to make the argument that all power belongs to God. All right? It doesn't belong to empires. It doesn't belong to human-like figures. It's going to assume, in a sense, that power inherently is probably going to corrupt if you think it is yours. Any person.
Well, all governments have some corruption in it because they're ruled by men, and we're not infallible, and we're greedy.
And it's not, and it's going to argue that even if you have the most righteous person, putting them in that position of authority is going to corrupt them. Why? Because there is a spiritual battle taking place behind this. And that is really one of the most distinctive things that's happening behind the scenes of this apocalyptic worldview. They saw everything that was happening. They saw the fact that they seemed trapped in this system of repetition, of empire just doing and doing, and also the fact they were keeping their faithfulness. Israel was. What did they believe about if they kept their faithfulness?
God would keep his covenant.
Then God would keep his covenant. And sure, they could explain those times when they were exiled, you know, sure, yeah, we can make sense of that. We can make sense of the fact that God drove us out because we got
Messed
hubris.
up.
We messed it, but now, I mean, we look what we did in Babylonia, you know, look at how faithful we were. How do we make sense of that? Well, clearly there are demonic forces at work.
One of the interesting things is that in ancient cultures, each culture, like the culture that conquers another one, they absorb some aspects of. Rome was not inventive.
Nope.
Rome absorbed the Greeks and all that, and they improved it, but they didn't invent anything but concrete, cement.
Yeah, and even at the time that this was written, they knew that even the Seleucids who were in charge of them were paying tribute to Rome.
Yeah.
You know? So it was just this like cycle. And for them, that interconnectedness, the fact that it all looks so similar, the fact that everything seemed to be working against them, those who wanted to live justly and righteously, it must be because that there is something demonic happening. That there is something behind the scenes, something that you can't see. That even when you think you're in control and doing something good, that is like pulling you back.
But that's one of the reasons why they were so suspicious of things, and they always looked to signs.
Mm-hmm. If you want to look at why Jesus exorcised so many people, because there really was such a visceral view of evil and like the suffering that we see that can only be explained by demonic, evil, cosmic forces.
No, Nero was a good example.
Who again was just a repetition of,
But he
you
was the
know.
only one.
And again, it points to the fact that they saw tyrants and empires as a symptom of a much larger systemic problem, right? You can't even just say, oh, Antiochus was this horrible, monstrous person, put all the blame on him, because that was the world of that culture, you know? Look at all the weird, I mean, if you look at the ways that empires would change and switch, it would feel like a reality TV show, right?
One of the, it's like Germany in the 1930s. All of these groups had propaganda experts.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the stuff that went on was due, and what they believed was due to propaganda.
Right.
It doesn't matter whether they had printed newspapers or not. It's what they're hammered over and over and over and over, and you start to believe it.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody hated the Jews.
Yeah.
All of it. Every major ancient civilization persecuted the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
They became the scapegoat for everybody.
Right.
Why? It's because what they were.
And regardless of how noble an empire would act like it was, they knew the reality because they were always, and of course they dealt with that in their own way. We have the temple, we have our people, we have our nation, God's going to take care of us, and through that, God will take care of the world. But we start to see this concern again for creation story now. You know, like, what if God is also wanting the whole world involved in this world? Again, reclaiming what's already there, but really re-emphasizing the fact that, like, oh, this whole thing we're talking about, like covenant and relationship with God, I mean, this really is like a creation thing. Like, we can't ignore our relationships with what's happening outside. We can't just go and act like that our actions aren't affecting those on the outside, because we're a part of the same thing that they are. The spiritual forces of wickedness.
I once heard that God created us to be led. We cannot, if we lead ourselves, we get in a big mess.
Yeah. And apocalyptic theology is really going to be pushing that dependence on God to do something.
Yeah.
Right. And we see today a lot of things that I think apocalyptic authors would have a big problem with. Because you would see empires like Rome demanding that Caesar's image be treated as a divine symbol. Antiochus, who believed that he was a divinely appointed ruler.
So, I mean, the English rulers, it was the divine right of king.
We would see the Jewish practices succumbing to these pagan rituals, succumbing to colonialism.
Well, and a lot of our holidays, or whatever you wanna call them, are based on Roman holidays, like Easter is, it was a celebration of Estar.
Yeah. But
She was a fertility goddess,
Yeah.
but they celebrated it about the time that Christ was crucified.
But we, again, it's not even just the government. Again, that's another thing. There was a Jewish group that decided to print Donald Trump's face with Cyrus. Why? Because Cyrus wasn't a moral person. But hey, he let the Jews back into Israel. Therefore, we can see him as divine in a sense, or divinely sent. And that was the argument they were making with our president. But it's not just him. And it's not just the government. It's something a lot larger, a lot more demonic, arguably, because it's something that seems to have us all, regardless of what we do or how hard we try to resist it. We have churches that have become spaces of capitalism and consumerism. You know? Do we think the gospel writers would have seen this as having a distinctive cultural identity? Would they see this as a countercultural gospel? Would they see saying that that God wants you to be rich, that God wants you to be happy, and that if you're not, well, then God doesn't love you, or you're doing something wrong? No, I don't think the apocalyptic writers would agree with that. I don't think the gospel would. Yet at the same time, it reminds those of us who are aware of that reality that this is something that's beyond any of these people that we see. It's beyond any of the single institutions or single groups that we might see as contributing to it, but in reality are caught in the same cycle that we all are.
In some cases, we support it.
Exactly. We're all connected. And in that sense, we need grace. We need God to do something. We need God to break into history. Because, call it what you want, but if left to our own devices, it seems like we're not the best at operating living in this world. And especially now where we have so many consequential things happening, and we're really focused on like what we can do and like what we need to be doing, to make this better, and like us trying to lead ourselves and assuming that we have the right answers and assuming that we know best for XYZ reason. And maybe we can ask ourselves, how are we supposed to walk in a way that God is the one writing the future? Because as we know from the gospel, that future is ultimately going to be one that's good, as long as we respond to it. So, it is 8 p.m. on the dot. I did have one more discussion question. We unfortunately didn't get to it. I just want to leave y'all saying
Hot take.
the hot take. I'm leaving everybody with a hot take each time. The point of Daniel is that faithfulness is demonstrated by a lack of cultural conformity, especially to empire, and especially to that very broad definition of empire. Maybe even to the point of saying, man, the devil's in some things. The devil's in some people. I've been saying that a lot more lately. Would have never thought I'd say that in my looking back on my growth and spiritual awareness, but the devil is in some people. And it's important that we lean into our faithfulness as a distinct community in order to push back. So, there we go.
Amen.
Amen. There we go. Thank you. Next week we will be getting to the Gospels, which is literally within 100, 200 years of Daniel. Right? So,
Any particular one that you want us to look at? before-
tell you what, if y'all look at the Gospel of Mark, no particular place, and thankfully it's also short and easy. That'll be you'll have a little bit of a place to stand for next time. Yeah, we'll definitely be looking at that. So, yeah, give Mark a look.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the questions. Yeah, of course. Good to see y'all again. I saw you on church too Sunday.
Yeah.
Awesome. Glad to see y'all.
Early.
Hey, that's all right. I'm there too. So.
Noise.
Nice. You learn a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, cool.
And we do a D&D campaign based on the apocalyptic literature.
Oh my god, I've actually thought about pulling some cause Gabriel and Michael and we pulling some Jewish midrash from that time.
Looked like a bed dragon to me.
You're right. You're right. You're right. We could use some see ya. Thank y'all. We could use some sort of Taras stats for one of them for the coming out of the ocean.
For sure.
Hey, and you know what's I forgot to mention it, but a lot of people would have recognized the water as alluding to the whole Tiamat story, which is already in
There we go.
D&D.
Sounds pretty easy to me.
Sounds easy. It's already set up.
Nice. Well, yeah, this is awesome.
Well, good.
Sunday, I'll be there in the gathering.
Have a good night. See you next week.
Can you just send Landon over whenever,
Yeah, totally.
whenever he gets there, and then I'll.
Absolutely. I gave him a little bit heads up, so he might come straight to you.
Okay.
But I'll send him your way.
Cool. Sounds good. All right. See you Sunday.
See you Sunday.
thought that the Bible study was every day. It wasn't.